Well, yesterday I talked about where Dan Lanning and the staff need to have the recruiting priorities in 2023. But looking even beyond that, where could their biggest strengths be? We'll ask John Garcia, Director of Recruiting for Sports Illustrated. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thanks for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. And I am joined by John Garcia Jr. once again, always in a different location last few times you've come on. I feel you're bouncing around. You always got that Sports Illustrated banner behind you. But, you know, I know the grind, man. You take the podcast, or in your case, the podcast appearances on the road, wherever you are. And it is great that you're able to make time and come on the show today.
Yes, sir. We try to get it in, but I am happy to be back in the Eastern time zone. It was a little rough going to Vegas, but look, it always is, right? I mean, that's kind of what's around or surrounding that city. But yeah, good to be on with you from at least 4 or 5 different locations over the last few months.
Yeah, you've been hopping around a little bit. You know, I was also down in Vegas for a little bit, and it was really fun. Got to see a lot of great Oregon players. Talked about the guys that I spoke to earlier in the week on the show. You can go check it out if you did not. But, you know, Dante Moore was one of those guys, and the first thing I asked him was, how's it been being here? And he goes, hot. Because it was about 105. You get on the turf, it can be like 120, 130, maybe even 140. I mean, it's toasty and whatnot. But let's get into the first big picture question I want to ask you here, John. And Dan Lanning's a defensive head coach, and Tosh Lupoi, probably the next best recruiter he's got on the staff on the defensive side of the ball. As you look at the makeup of this new Oregon staff, what are your impressions with regards to what you think their biggest recruiting strengths could be? Maybe a position group or a type of player that they'll be able to bring in.
Oh, man, that's a great question, because there's a lot of, first of all, youth, which is really important towards resonating with obviously the target demographic, which is, you know, teenagers and early 20-somethings football players. So there's youth, and there's kind of a balanced experience on this roster. Guys who have coached throughout college football, a few who have dipped their toes into the NFL as well. So I think you could really push that in multiple directions. I think if you get into the, you know, position specific coaches, I mean, certainly Tosh Lupoi deserves his due as like you said, maybe the ace on the recruiting staff, but there's a few others. I mean, I think Adrian Clem up front coaching the offensive lineman is pretty darn well respected. Kenny Dillingham is a guy that, you know, quarterbacks, you know, get wide-eyed when they talk about. So I think that position group, and we know the targets that are out there for the Ducks, that group will be probably solid here going forward. I think you can go in a lot of different directions here. I'd probably, I mean, Junior Adams has a reputation, and he's been, in terms of his position, he has been recruiting as well or better than any position coach on that coaching staff relative to tangible targets picking Oregon. I think that group is probably the hottest that we'll talk about with the Ducks right now. So if you ask me today, I'll go Junior Adams, but I think long-term it's Tosh Lupoi. I think, again, Clem, Dillingham, I like Carlos Locklin's great. He's going to keep Oregon involved in the South. I mean, it's a pretty solid staff for this being the first time Dan Lanning has done this. I think it couldn't have gone much better in terms of regionally pulling from different experiences and getting guys who, at the end of the day, recruit, because that's still what it's really about. And I think that was probably, you know, priority one for Lanning when he started to build a staff. I want to bring in guys who I know can recruit because they've already been there and done that.
When you look at the players that Lanning brought in as a defensive coordinator at Georgia, there are a lot of guys who are now going to the NFL, right? You've got Lewis Seen, Nakobe Dean, and Jordan Davis. Of course, Trayvon Walker, the number one overall pick. Do you think it's a reasonable expectation for Duck fans to, you know, expect to see that caliber of player come in on the defensive side of the ball?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's just got to be tempered, right? Like anything else, it's going to take time to build that. Even at Georgia, this is like last year was an anomaly, in general for Georgia. I mean, they always have great players and they always send players to the NFL, but you don't break records and win the national title every year. So it was obviously a pretty special group. They won't duplicate the numbers after this following season in 2022. So even for them, it was kind of an apex moment. So you expect Dan to begin to build towards that at a place like Oregon. It does take time, but yeah, I think that is reasonable to begin to expect that, because not only, does Oregon have a kind of a stranglehold on Pac-12 recruiting dating back to the last staff. And again, as we just mentioned, Dan has built a national staff of recruiters underneath him, but Oregon's also had those kind of players, maybe not in bulk, but they've had those kind of players that go pretty darn early in the draft. I think the last 2 years you've had a top 10 pick coming from UO. So up front, one on offense, one on defense. So I do think that those are reasonable expectations, but they do need to have an asterisk up there. Like, hey, maybe in time, not necessarily, hey, year one, Oregon's going to have the same, front seven that Georgia just won the national championship with. Obviously, that's pretty unreasonable.
They've had the two players going in the trenches, right? Penei Sewell and Kayvon Thibodeau the last couple of years, top 10 picks, one offense, one defense. And the year before that, of course, the number 6 overall pick, Justin Herbert, the quarterback position, always a big subject of discussion. And Jaden Rashada has, kind of become, I think, one of the top names, maybe the top name amongst Duck fans that they're looking at as a potential next big time signal caller to come through. He's listed his official commitment date as June 18th. As we record this on Wednesday, this is Thursday's episode. That's going to be this coming Saturday. But I talked with him in Vegas. I know you've heard this sort of thing as well. He seems like a guy who is, a little bit overwhelmed, I think, by the process. And I mean, it could be a lot. You're a 16, 17-year-old kid, and these big time programs you've watched for years are coming after you and whatnot. So what's the latest that you're hearing on Rashada's recruitment?
Well, look, first of all, the kid was exhausted, right? Last week, he took 3 SEC official visits in a row. It actually goes to 4 because he was with his brother at Ole Miss for his official visit. He had then committed to Ole Miss, of course. Then he flew to Texas A&M, then LSU, then Florida. So really 10 flights in a matter of 6 or 7 days. This is before he got to Vegas, which was another 2 flights, obviously there and back from Pittsburgh, California. So you're talking 12 flights in like 8 days. It's a lot for anybody, much less a 17-year-old kid who, by the way, is asked to perform in Vegas at those Dante Moore, temperatures that we talked about earlier, that everybody felt. I mean, heck, I was just shooting video and I was feeling it, and I'm from Miami and I was still like, wow, this is different out here. So I think, first of all, he was kind of exhausted and he really wanted to get to this week because this was going to be the time where he could sit back and relax and truly go into evaluation mode and start to try, keyword there, try to make a pick between these top 7 schools that he listed a couple of weeks ago. And obviously, when you take 3 SEC visits in a row, you're going to get a whole lot of steak. You're going to get a whole lot of love and a whole lot of, whining and dining, if you will. So I do think that takes its own toll, independent of trying to make a football pick as well. And he kind of hinted as much, although he did get that long-awaited first impression of Texas A&M and Jimbo Fisher. And I think it was really positive. They're going to stay in this race until the end. But that's the question. Is the end Saturday? I think that's the main takeaway talking to him out there in Vegas. And again, early this week, briefly, he kind of doesn't know. And certainly over the weekend, he did not know, even privately, hey, what school am I going to? He didn't have that answer. So I do think that there's a potential pushback ahead. I don't think it's the most likely scenario, but if he does, I think your audience will be most excited because I do think that benefits basically all the other schools in the race, right? Whether you're talking Miami, Oregon in particular, I think if he waits, you can maybe bring him back to Eugene and he can actually utilize an official visit for his time up there, which he did not do earlier this spring when he got back up to campus. And then obviously your chances increase towards landing one of the top quarterbacks in the country. But if he sticks to Saturday, there is a little bit more buzz coming off those visits with the Florida Gators and with the aforementioned Texas A&M. So it's going to be quite interesting. Not only does he commit on Saturday, but obviously, where the heck is he going? And I think, at least recently, he hasn't even had that answer privately.
Yeah, he's not sure where he's going to play his college ball at this point in time, but I am sure that our friends at Built are always coming out with amazing new flavors. See what I did there? And this time they've outdone themselves with a mud pie flavor. It is a mud pie bar and a mud pie puff. They've got both of them. If you aren't sure what that means, if you're a chocolate fan, you're just going to absolutely love it. Rich whipped cream and chocolate mousse smothered in 100% real chocolate and topped with a cookies and cream crumble. I don't know what else you need to hear if you're a dessert fan out there. 150 calories, 8 grams of sugar, 16 grams of protein. Go to Built.com, use promo code LOCK15. Get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKed15 for 15% off your next order of Built Bars at Built.com. The fascinating thing with Rashada to me is he's a California native, and the biggest schools in the mix are a Florida, a Texas A&M, a Miami, LSU, and Oregon is the outlier. Is there a particular reason you think that there's such a strong likelihood that he's not going to stay on the West Coast?
Well, yeah, I mean, it looks like he just values that SEC footprint. He's a kid who, before Vegas, when we talked to him, he just always talks about competing and kind of rising to that occasion. And I think, if you go by winning, if you go by the NFL draft to a degree, certainly the schools in SEC and ACC country as well down there just have been producing at a higher clip, and the competition level in some of those leagues, the SEC West in particular, is obviously as good as it gets nationally. So I do think there is an appeal to not only compete at a high-end Power 5 program, but to do so week in, week out against equally competitive competition. And I think that's something that he is really taking a liking to, the scope and the scale of football, what it means in some of those areas is something that he's talked about, and how everybody kind of buys into it. I think that's a big part of it. And that's something in the Pac-12 that they've had to push back against really forever. It feels like there's more metro areas. There's more pro sports in that part of the country as well. So it's just one of those, I think, perceptional deals that Jaden has certainly heard consistently on the recruiting trail. But yeah, we've heard that, he wants to leave the Pac-12 footprint most likely. But again, there's still some uncertainty with this kid's decision, but it is hard to ignore the, I guess, bright lights of the SEC in particular when you talk about Texas A&M and Florida specifically.
One guy who's on his 7-on-7 team that Oregon fans should know the name of by now is Jurion Dickey, who, was a good commitment when the Ducks got him a few weeks ago, and he's class of 2023 out of Valley Christian High School in the Bay Area in California. But it seems to me, and you can correct me if you feel, differently, but it seems to me ever since that commitment, his stock has just continued to go up and up and up, and he's getting even more attention. I mean, he's a 4-star, pretty highly rated recruit. He's got great agility, good hands. He's a crisp route runner too. He's a lot bigger than I think a lot of people would imagine. I stood next to him and talked to him over the weekend. He's a pretty well built guy, but he was an OT7 MVP on day 2, and more people are just taking notice. Is that kind of your sense as well, that he seems to be getting more and more attention, and then that commitment is looking like a better one for Oregon?
Yeah, I think the more we see from Jurion, the happier Oregon fans should be. But the more other programs are like, hey, let's take a second look at this guy. He's pretty good. I know Miami's trying to get into the game there a little bit. But yeah, he was great out in Vegas. Loved him on tape. Loved his profile for a couple years now. My contacts on the West Coast have loved him every time they've seen him. I'd only seen him on tape before last weekend, so it was about as good a first impression, physically as any receiver made out that way. And like you said, though, the main takeaway, we knew he was pretty polished and explosive. But then you look at him and like, man, this kid's like legitimately 6'2", like 185 pounds or so, kind of rocked up as well. And you're like, this is like a guy that looks like a wide receiver. I know they come in all shapes and sizes, But when Jurion Dickey walks past you, you're like, that's a wide receiver who can play outside, probably play inside, and challenge a very good defensive back without even watching him take a rep. And then he takes reps against great DBs and makes a ton of plays while playing with Jaden Rashada, as you mentioned, for the Miami Immortals. You couldn't miss him either, right? He had the bucket hat on out there even at nighttime, because why not? He's a big fisherman, and certainly is comfortable, playing with that on. So yeah, he was easy to spot, but you couldn't miss him even if you tried, because he was catching a bunch of touchdowns down the field, short to intermediate. He kind of did everything for that team and was their top guy. And that alone says a lot, because they have Jaylen Brown on that team, who's considered a 5-star by some. They have Robbie Washington on that team, who's one of the faster receivers in the country and a national recruit who's committed to Miami. So they have a boatload of great receivers on that roster, but everybody there would tell you that their wide receiver one in that tournament was Jurion Dickey, and he went out there and snatched that away from somebody out in Vegas. So stock up 100%.
Yeah, and I think when you watch him, he can run around you because he's not just fast with straight line speed, but he's agile as well. Oregon fans think back to like Devin Allen. I wouldn't think of him as a super, agile or shifty guy, but his straight line speed is, of course, remarkable because he's a track star, and he's, of course, got to deal with the Eagles right now. Whereas, a guy like DeAnthony Thomas has had, that jitterbug ability, right? And Jurion looks like he's just got both, and he's explosive, but he also is not afraid of contact either. I mean, he will run through you. He will, get physical during his routes. I mean, I was really, really impressed seeing him, and it was. We'll see where Rashada ends up committing. From what I've gathered, it doesn't look like the Ducks are in the lead form right now. But those two linking up kind of had me thinking about what could possibly be one day in Eugene in the future. But I want to get to two more guys here on the show today with John Garcia, the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated. One of them is an offensive lineman. That's Adrian Clem's department, of course. A guy by the name of Olaus Alanen. I'm going to pray that I'm pronouncing that last name correctly, but we'll just refer to him as Olaus because I'm pretty sure he's the only Olaus out there on the recruiting trail. So
yes,
what sort of player is he on the offensive line, and what's his recruitment like? Because from what I saw, the Ducks were kind of a late addition to his school considerations, but they appear to be kind of moving more into the fold for him.
Yeah, he's had this top 4 for quite some time. He's been taking a bunch of visits right now, actually, in the middle of June. Like a lot of prospects are ahead of maybe some summer verbal commitments. And then the other day, he's like, hey, I need to add Oregon to this list because I'm actually going to take an official visit out that way. So clearly the Ducks have been in consistent communication, and the feeling of at least vetting Eugene fully came across the European natives' mind, and that's a big deal for the Ducks because this is a heavy-hitting recruitment, right? It's Georgia, it's Alabama, Miami has been involved here for quite some time. So to get into this kind of race, I do think it says quite a lot about Clem, about Lanning, about the entire offensive staff in particular, because he seemed kind of set, right? There's a lot of Alabama buzz. He was there last weekend. He was at Miami prior to that, and his parents stayed in Miami a little bit longer than expected to kind of just take it all in. They likened it to some of the metros out in Europe, so certainly that makes a lot of sense from the hurricane angle. So really, whether it's program prestige wise at Alabama or in terms of a big city like Miami, you could kind of make that argument and build it either way for him. So to add Oregon to it kind of at the last minute, I thought was one, surprising, but two, telling. I mean, I think one of his first offers came from Oregon a couple years ago. Obviously, that was under Mario Cristobal, who hunts offensive linemen. I guess now we could say Oregon hunts O-linemen all over the world, right? Because he's coming from Europe. So I think, that was something that certainly, resonated with the family. And now he's going to set this trip and at least take it to give the Ducks a fighting chance here. I would say more than a fighting chance, a chance to really improve the overall perception of the program, because obviously this coaching staff has only been able to recruit him for, 6-7 months or so. So they're going to get their chance to really nail it home and present something different. And I think that's a good thing because, like we said, we've got the kind of established prestige of certain programs. We've got the big metro, big city, Miami involved, and now Oregon could present something maybe in between that. And maybe that's something that is appealing to Allen and his family, who will accompany him on that trip up to Eugene. So fascinating kid, massive recruit physically and figuratively as well, as again, Oregon continues to recruit nationally and internationally against the best of the best, which is another indicator of where this program is going, at least from a recruiting standpoint.
Yeah, and I talked yesterday on the show about how I think offensive line is almost surprisingly to some, perhaps, one of the biggest needs from a recruiting standpoint going forward for Dan Lanning and the staff, because you've got, maybe the best offensive line unit in the Pac-12 this year, guys like TJ Bass and Alex Forsyth, who made Athlon Sports preseason all Pac-12 first team. And then you've got, Big Sala in there and Stephen Jones. Like, there's just a lot of really good players up front, but they're all about to leave. I mean, the only guy who could come back is Stephen Jones, and he might be an NFL caliber guy. So you could be looking at a brand new offensive line. You have to kind of usher in that new era. And that's why I think offensive line is, a place where Adrian Clem and Dan Lanning and the staff need to be able to recruit well in the class of 2023. I think it's even more important than quarterback right now, because you're just going to lose so much depth, so much experience, and you're just going to need bodies at some point. And speaking of bodies, they did add one via the transfer portal at the JUCO level, which is not something I think Oregon has done a lot of. It's not like it's unheard of, but it's definitely happened more with Oregon basketball than it has for Oregon football. But their latest addition, a guy by the name of Braden Zolkowski. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And interesting guy, because he's at the JUCO level. He's 6'7", 310 pounds, which is just, that's a mountain of a man. How does a guy like, before I ask you about him specifically, I think you see this sometimes just, across the college football landscape. How does a guy of that size not come out with even a Division I offer? Why would somebody who's that big not be able to find even group of 5 school who wants to take a shot on him and hope that they can develop him when he's that big?
It's usually one of two things, Spencer. One, it's academics, and I'm not saying that's the case here, but when you go JUCO, that's usually a big predisposed part of why you had to look that way. But I think also coming up in the state of Oregon and not being that level of a prospect, I think certainly impacted his recruitment. I talked about this on another show yesterday. There's certain parameters that other schools check out. If you are in a certain, really in any state, and the premier institution from a football perspective, or two, in this case, Oregon State as well, didn't jump in, there's hey, what's going on here? Is there an issue? Is there something going on, et cetera? So it could kind of, sinkhole your entire recruitment before it ever starts. I'm not saying that's the case. I don't know the specifics intimately here, but that usually is a bit of a predetermined factor as to why things can go against the grain just a little bit. But looking at his tape a little bit, he's incredibly raw. I'm not sure how much experience he has at the high school, or really at the offensive line position in particular. So it was probably necessary for him, at least experience-wise, to hit the junior college ranks to get a little more reps under his belt. He lines up at right tackle. Like you said, he's 6'7", so playing at a low plane is going to be tough, just scientifically, right? It's just that much harder for a guy that tall to play extremely low, but the frame is absolutely there. And there's a need for depth, so you could understand why they took him ahead of the 22 season, where he's, I think, going to be able to transfer in and get going immediately. So it's going to be an uphill battle for him, but from a frame perspective, from a length perspective, you could understand why he was brought in. And if it works out, he'll be one of the great stories on that Oregon roster.
Do you think there's such a thing on the offensive line, and he might fall into this category if he ends up never seeing the field, maybe has to transfer again or something? And again, that's just a hypothetical to frame my question here. Do you think there's such a thing as being too big to be on an offensive line? Do you have to strike some balance as as a player from a body standpoint, and what you have to look and be like?
That's a great question. I think certainly the position parameters we used to look at physically at the offensive line have changed, right? You used to be the bigger the better to a degree, but with the change in philosophy offensively across the sport at every level, everyone's getting a little bit smaller, right? You're playing in space a lot more laterally than you used to. Used to just be me and you in a phone booth and may the strongest and best, your leverage guy win. It's not quite that simple anymore. A lot of these offensive linemen are pass blockers primarily, guys who are asked to occupy a zone, an area, more so than taking a guy on one-on-one and being the aggressor, the initiator in that back and forth. So the offensive tackle position in particular has really changed a lot over the last 5 to 10 years. And yeah, I think length is still incredibly important, and you can't be 5'10" trying to block, these great edge rushers either. But yeah, it's certainly not the bigger the better like it maybe once was, especially relative to some of these run heavy schemes that we used to see in college football. Nowadays, it's the total opposite. It's, hey, I need length and athleticism more than this big refrigerator of a person who could just kind of lean on a defensive lineman and occupy that blocker. It's not that simple anymore. So yeah, I do think that frame is something that is going to be, questionable to look at going forward. But again, he's not the heaviest guy. I do think he's got some decent traits on tape. There's a little bit of pop on contact there, but he's certainly more comfortable as a run blocker today than in pass blocker. So I do think it'll take some time for him to get his bearings once he does get to Oregon for good. And that's something to keep an eye on.
All the recruiting insight you could ever need. John Garcia Jr., the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated. Appreciate it, as always, making your weekly appearance here on Locked On Ducks.
Thanks for having me, Spencer. Take care.
Thanks for making Locked On Ducks your first listen. Go make Locked On Pac-12 your second, where I'm hosting, talking about the Conference of Champions. I appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.